Just in some respects to take on and up from where some of the presentations have already been over the course of the morning, I hope my presentation, that of Stephen's, will reflect some of that shared thinking from within the network itself. And in a sense, whilst we're talking about an island of 8 million people, our focus is very much on the public management element of the 8 million people. Now, we'll talk about where those 8 million people might be and so on, and I'm sure John would be happy to talk about National Planning Framework and its development, etc. But very much we want to try and focus in on implications as things stand now and where things are going in terms of international trends and public service change, and how that might apply to getting to an island of 8 million people. Hope I get this right. Ah, yeah. Right, I know how to work the laptop. That's a good sign. So, just to kick off, when we look at public management, indeed, Declan has referred to this to some extent, and others have as well. Critics, reasoned or otherwise, may argue that much of what we do and how we do it in terms of our organisations and structures are based upon 19th century configurations. Areas like education, local government, policing and justice. And many will also argue that the overall perspective in policy development in this country has been driven traditionally by a rural perspective rather than an urban perspective. And that was a perfectly reasonable approach to take in many respects, because Irish society was largely a rural society. Its traditions, even within the urbanised parts of the island, were very much coming through and from a rural perspective. In saying that, if we are moving towards an 8 million, 10 million, whatever figure you want to pick out of the air over the next 25, 30 years, can we begin to think in terms of actually planning in an urbanised context? I'm not just talking about planning in terms of where the houses are going, but planning in terms of how we organise our public structures and the policies that underpin such structures. Now, again, as Declan has pointed out, we have had a period of ongoing management reconfiguration within the public service, and in many respects the Department of Public Expenditure Reform has been quite successful in bringing in good management practice, the sorts of things one would expect to find in other public arenas. We have however seen relatively limited structural change, so our very disaggregated, highly siloed structures at national level find themselves at local level in terms of service delivery, making it almost impossible at times to get agencies to work together to a common theme, a common vision, a common perspective in delivering badly needed public services. Again, points which have been highlighted over the course of the morning. We do continue to have challenges around our undeveloped systems of accountability, which Peter very clearly highlighted in the context of public procurement, but it is generally the case that very often it is actually difficult to get in behind why a decision was taken, how it was taken, and how one might account for that particular decision in a particular policy arena. And in that we're not unusual. Concepts of concealed administration are quite common across the OECD. Decisions that are taken by, for example, elite groups within the organisations that underpin public service, the lack of transparency associated with such decisions by said elite groups. This is not unusual in the OECD, but it does seem to be a particular feature of much of how we organise ourselves in policy development terms in this country. Ireland in the coming times. Well, we're looking at potentially a population back in 1980 of 3.2 million, growing to 6.5 million in terms of the Republic by 2050, give or take. So we are potentially, as an island, going to finally get to where we were in the 1840s in terms of our overall population. And as has been said by various commentators, this actually means that we will have the equivalent, give or take, of a Limerick and environs that we have to provide for, which Ronan has highlighted, in terms of housing need, etc., every year for the next 25, 35 years. And there are very real questions which the National Planning Framework is hopefully going to address in the context of where we are going to put them. Accepting that, how do we actually then set the administrative and political priorities for the next 25, 30 years to cope with that change? Because bear in mind that currently we continue to provide around 40% of our housing stock on a one-off basis in rural communities. We have a demographic process that is going to fundamentally change as society ages hugely, requiring reconfigured public services, again in a rural context, and that operating alongside a radically urbanised island. So it is a quite different policy environment that we enter into over the next 20-25 years from that which we were in over the past 90 to 100 years. We've also got to confront the fourth industrial revolution, which is right on our doorstep as things are happening. I've mentioned the idea of the aging society and whether we treat our society in that context or we focus on our society as a society which is fully engaged, reflecting indeed the points that Declan and Edmund were making this morning. How do we recreate our structures to move beyond the boundaries which are often set by public managers and politicians in order to cope with the changes that are required by that changing society? And alongside that, how do we address, in the context of how we organise our public service, in terms of the relationship between artificial intelligence, robotics, in a changed public service environment? Because a lot of the jobs which are currently done by public servants are no longer going to necessarily be done by human beings in 5, 10, 15 years' time. If we look at it, public service initiatives in other countries, the interface between robotic and artificial intelligence is having a very significant impact in terms of the effectiveness of public service delivery on a geographic basis, but also on a national basis and a policy-themed basis across the OECD. We're just beginning to move into that arena in areas like health, for example. The impact of the Internet of Things has been commented on quite a lot, and advancing of 3D technology in terms of how we actually design and deliver public services, again, is a new demand and challenge confronting the public service in the Irish context. It does mean that we have got to look at new and renewed skills. And therein lies a huge challenge for the public service itself, because cultural change is slow, it is difficult when it comes to bringing in transition and migration into new thinking. Are we equipped, have we got the institutional framework in place to allow us to do that against the sort of pressures, politically and administratively, which will come through with a growth of population of the order that we're talking about? The new public servant is now seen as somebody or people who can manage complexity. And complexity is subject to interpretation, again, as Des pointed out very successfully in this afternoon's paper. People management, Declan's point about HR. We are only beginning to implement integrated HR practice within our public service in the most recent years. And we have quite some distance, notwithstanding the progress that Declan's pointed out, we have still quite some distance to go in that regard. Our engagement with human factors and the demography that is associated with an ageing society is going to be a critical feature for us, something we have not had to deal with over the last 10, 15 years, given the relative youthfulness of the population. All of these factors are radically going to change expectation, need and demand politically and in terms of the wider population for the types of public services that are delivered currently and into the future. In fact, there are aspects of public service delivery which we don't even recognise yet as a necessity in terms of how we configure the organisation of those very public services. So, public administration on the island, from my perspective, we need to look at and underpin rural and urban competencies with 21st century structures to enable us to do so. Reflecting on points that I was making at last year's seminar, and which hopefully will find its thinking reflected in the National Planning Framework, are the idea of gateway institution settings. How do we organise our cities, our city regions? Where do levels of responsibility rest within those? We have the debate at the moment about the Dublin Mayor. What's the point if the Dublin Mayor doesn't have responsibility for areas of mandate which are currently beyond that of local government? It's a waste of a position. If we look at successful models for mayoral government in a city region context, we see mayors with real substantive powers. If they have substantive powers, it means others lose those powers. Does the mayor of Dublin, mayor of Cork, become responsible for industrial policy in Dublin or Cork? Try that one on the Minister for Enterprise and Jobs. The absence of economic analysis has also been highlighted, particularly strongly in Peter's case, but generally we have a very weak application of analysis from an economic perspective in our policy development. There's been very poor implementation of regulatory impact assessment in this country relative to what we find in other countries. And I say that as somebody who was involved with the first round of regulatory impact analysis back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Citizen-centred delivery is a focus that is very often highlighted in public documents, public policy documents, but very rarely actually underpinned by the structures through which that should be enabled. And yet, there's a clear need and expectation, particularly within an urbanised context, but even in rural areas which might take a more traditional view of engagement with politics and administration, on how we plan for and deliver services that are citizen-centred. Declan highlighted performance and management issues and issues around leadership and transition. Shouldn't be underestimated the necessity of change in our thinking and how we manage the process of leadership within the public service. Who is actually the leader is very often the question we need to ask, because there's clear confusion in the wider public of who is actually in charge. These are facets of thinking which are applicable generally across the OECD. So there are models, some of them have been highlighted already this morning, that we can learn from. That doesn't necessarily mean that we follow them fully or substantively. Clearly there are cultural dimensions to the way the Irish operate, which are different to the way the Austrians operate or the Finns or whatever. Nonetheless, they are useful learning platforms. And certainly the idea of learning from similar type economies with similar demographics and so on might be more relevant to us than models that may be applicable from the traditional model that we looked at, which is in the United Kingdom. That isn't to say it isn't relevant. Scotland in many respects has great relevance to us, but nonetheless there are other options out there that go beyond the immediacy of our neighbouring island. Certainly, however, saying that, when it comes to public service configuration, there is a clear understanding of its placement within a spatial context, an identifiable context, so that people can exist and support and underpin the delivery of public services, having an acknowledged understanding in terms of local identity. Iterative and co-governance models are increasingly common across the OECD. And what we mean by that is that there is integration between the local, regional and national at a level that we don't necessarily fully appreciate in this country, but which will be, I think, fundamental necessity if we are going to handle the growth of population that we are looking at potentially over the next 20-25 years. I've already mentioned issues around citizenship and citizen-centred services being locally organised. And it was interesting in looking at Declan's data this morning that 49% seem to have a relatively high level of trust in NGOs, and yet some of the most critical areas in terms of delivery of public service in this country have been around the failure of accountability within NGOs that are dependent upon funding and resourcing from the public sector, because we haven't put in place processes to manage our arm's length delivery regimes in the way that one would expect to find in other countries, particularly in and around the idea of having multi-annual compacts between the NGO regime and the policy regime that exists within either local or indeed national government. And a further key challenge to us, again coming back to issues around data, is data is only useful if we understand it in the context of service standards and evaluation, and we're particularly weak in many areas in that context over much of the public service. I talked about spatial planning, talked about it last year. The National Spatial Strategy has had some successes. One of the areas actually, and kind of contradicting myself here, one of the areas where it has been successful is that it has allowed us to create an understanding of the regional dynamics of local economies and having the data behind that to give us a sense of understanding. But there's still quite some distance to go in terms of relating that to the needs into the future, given the context of, say, the fourth industrial revolution, to regional delivery of public services. So, are we going to accept the traditional approach to how we organise this country on the basis of a population which is simply spread across the country, urban, rural, with no clear policy identity associated with either the needs of rural community or indeed the increasing needs of urban society? How are we going to create platforms for active citizen engagement? I've been involved in this area for the last 30 years, and I've got to a point where I really do question the level of commitment to active engagement with our citizens on the part of our public services. That may be a controversial statement to make, but when you look at the trends of engagement over the last 20-25 years and look at the impact which that engagement has had in actual policy development, you do question the validity of that engagement in the first case. It is very, very unusual to see substantive change to policy arising from the sorts of engagement we've encouraged over the last 20-25 years, notwithstanding the well-intentioned approach which may have been taken across many public services.
5 minutes, Sean.
Nearly at the end, Peter. So we have issues around that. We have issues around adequate and the uneven evidence base, and even our understanding of what the necessary evidence base should be when we come to making policy in local, regional and national government. Understanding the intangible features of identity and how that should be applied in a rigorous policy framework is very, very difficult. And we've seen examples of that in the last 12-18 months, with clearly different understanding about the impact of local identity with that of a national policy initiative. And we've seen it in particular in regards to local government reform, but we're not just seeing it in local government reform, we're also seeing it in health service reform. Critical challenge to the national planning framework is the idea of integrating our spatial planning with the management of the environment in a growing economy. Coming back, in fact, to the points that Ronan was highlighting this morning. On the one level, do we continue to have this disassembled approach to the delivery of housing, services, private sector investment and so on, or do we focus in on those valued sites? And it was interesting, having been working in Bavaria last week, that a number of people who'd been to Ireland, who were planners, are actually picking up this and coming back with this impression of Ireland in the context of our inability to maximise the value from really valuable land. And they were just visiting Ireland, they were picking that up because this is a key concept to them, because land in their context is so valuable because of so many bloody mountains to deal with and where they can put people in a growing population. So an interesting viewpoint coming forward there that is very relevant to how we think in the growing economy that we're looking at. There are competing demands of urbanised state versus rural. I'm not convinced that our political framework necessarily accepts that and is willing to go with that because it means very harsh and hard decisions about where people will actually live, where they will actually get educated, where they will actually work. And it may be that there are parts of rural Ireland which will have to be, as in other countries, put into aspic almost. And this is certainly something that Denmark has had to confront in the last 5 to 10 years as part of their austerity process. The concept of actually closing down primary schools deliberately and moving children in rural societies 50 to 60 kilometres a day to private or to public schools across Denmark is now an accepted feature of policy in education in Denmark. Is that something we could even begin to think about and contemplate? Be an interesting argument to deal with in terms of local villages, etc. We may actually have to confront that if we are to have the resources to allow us to continue to invest in primary education in the first case, let alone tertiary education. And as Peter's pointed out, we don't have necessarily, or maybe we've been unwilling to use the tools that allow us to underpin a robust policy development framework. RIA was rolled out in this country with great intent and has been largely parked here. And I think we see, as a consequence, quite an amount of challenge to how we come to decisions. I've gone through the public service reform process generally, internationally. So I won't go back into that. Just to conclude, I think, and I suspect this is coming true from a lot of our presentations, and maybe it's one of the reasons why we try to organise these sorts of symposia. We really do need far more rigorous and substantive debate on how and where and why we're going to look by 2035, 2050. I understand that when the Oireachtas met recently to look at the National Planning Framework, something like 7 members turned up. That doesn't augur well for how Ireland is going to look by 2050, I would suggest. Why is it we're failing to engage and get those messages across? As experts, we have all that knowledge, and yet we seem to be unable to work with our political process to create the realisation of the significance of these sorts of policy initiatives. And that's just one example. There are many other examples. Local government has been highlighted here consistently over the course of the morning, and yet we still have a regime which is very restricted, limited mandate, limited levels of accountability, limited levels of innovation to move into new areas and to move towards a more European-based local government system. What's the scope for independent regional dynamics? Do we accept that Greater Dublin is in a different regional dynamic economically, socially, to that of Cork or Limerick, for example? Huge challenge, very, very significant to try and bridge that particular, or to go over that particular barrier from a political perspective. Our rural development, we now have the beginnings of a rural development policy through a new department underpinned by the PPAN report. But there's been very little substantive implementation on the ground because of the lack of resources. Are we willing to begin to commit to that against the background of having to commit to huge resources into our urban centres? Again, a very significant challenge. In my view, our gateway cities need far more financial autonomy. So coming back to our mayor for Dublin or our mayor for Cork, if they're going to have a substantive positive role to play, and if we look at models from other countries, and not the London model, which everybody seems to look at, which is probably one of the least appropriate models to look at in the Irish context, what we do see are mayors with executive responsibility and powers over how things may be resourced. I was struck by Innsbruck in the past week. I was talking to a number of people over coffee. A city of 140,000 people. It's a linear development because of the nature of the mountain ranges that's around it. It has its underground, it has its tram lines, it has its hospital, etc. Now these didn't arise overnight. It's the subject of long-term planning. It's the subject of long-term policy implementation. A willingness politically to think beyond the next electoral cycle. That's a big, big challenge in the Irish political environment. If we do nothing else today, and hopefully from these ongoing symposia that we'll be organising, that we try and create a frank, open discussion about where Ireland is and where it should be, if we can use the forthcoming national planning framework to do so, then I think we'll have achieved something. But that's only the starting point. There's a long way to go. Thanks very much.